Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Jerome Gallia from the USF School of Social Work, and you have joined us for today's Access Lab Journal Club. Today's guest speaker is a friend and colleague and recent USF School of Social Work graduate, Kara Green. I almost said Dr. Green, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. That soon I will be saying that.
Not there
I'm sure.
Yet.
Before I talk about the presentation that Kara will be doing, I wanted to also take this opportunity to share with you a new development for the USF School of Social Work Access Lab, and that is the official launch. You are the first to see it, of our Access Lab website. And so if you go to the USF School of Social Work and look under labs, you can learn all about the work that the USF Access Lab does. You can meet the different collaborators in our lab, including some folks that you'll recognize here today. If you're part of USF, you could join our team. You can read about the research that our lab is doing, our media presentations, of course, the journal club here in which this presentation will appear, and so forth. So I'm happy to present this as a resource that hopefully will be, an evolving, living space for the products of our lab. Today's presentation is based on work that our lab is doing, is collaborating with several other sites. That main academic research partner and principal investigator in the study is Dr. Brandon Brown from University of California, Riverside, who I see is in the audience today. Hi, Dr. Brown. Thank you for joining us. And his project, or our project, because it's something that we've been collaborating on, although he really has taken the lead on this and it was his original idea, was really helping explore how incentives, specifically cash incentives, but other incentives as well, and payments, affect willingness to participate in research, specifically higher risk research or biomedical research, and specifically HIV research. And Dr. Brown and colleagues were awarded a 2-year grant to explore the factors that are involved in making decisions for research incentives, and then developing a framework for which incentive types and amounts could be later arrived at. Kara Green joined the team actually right at the beginning of the study, so over a year ago, is the study coordinator and has been instrumental in that study on so many different levels, but also this recent publication on which describes the protocol of this study. And so Kara Green, social worker Kara Green, I wish there was a better title. I want to give you a title. MSW Kara Green will now present the work that she's been so intimately involved in. So I will pass the microphone to you, Kara. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Gallia, for the warm welcome. I will go ahead and share my screen with my presentation slides that I have right here. Okay. Can everybody see this okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. So today I will be talking about our protocol paper, which is centered around developing a framework to ethically incentivize participants involved in biomedical HIV research. On the outset, what our protocol paper was targeted to have a solution for is the following problem, in that there's currently difficulty establishing incentive types and amounts due to significant variability across studies, even similar studies or in the same institution. The federal law, specifically the Food and Drug Administration, expressly prohibits providing compensation to offset study participation risks. But there's differing characterization of undue inducement by IRBs and researchers. So, because different stakeholders involved in HIV biomedical research characterize undue inducement, which means that a participant may be more willing to accept higher risk if an incentive is offered that they feel makes that risk something they're willing to accept. There's that characterization can differ tremendously, and we want to capture that in our research. To do so, we are conducting our CASH study, which Dr. Gallia said is led by Principal Investigator Dr. Brandon Brown at UC Riverside. In this study, we call it CASH, Considerations Around Study Honoraria. And we have three main project outcomes that we hope to achieve. One is that we want to determine different stakeholder groups' views about incentives. This includes people living with HIV who might actually be participating in clinical research, researchers who are conducting the studies, institutional review board members, and bioethicists. We also want to understand shared decision making on relevant study factors that are considered when deciding on an ethical incentive for a research study. Another thing we hope to achieve is an understanding of how well our chosen factors predict incentive decision making. So this third project outcome will be achieved by the culmination of the results in the first two outcomes. It's important to first understand how we define incentive and reimbursement, as those terms can sometimes be used interchangeably by researchers and ethics boards, but they mean something different. For our study, an incentive is something that's received specifically to increase the chance of participation and study retention in a research project. We think of incentives that are usually given in the form of cash, checks, gift cards, or something with monetary value. It's also important to note that we consider receiving free healthcare in exchange for study participation as an incentive as well. As we've heard from some of our participants that they often receive better healthcare in the clinical trial that they might be participating in than they do in their primary or infectious disease care. We consider reimbursement to be payment that's received to cover any out-of-pocket costs that might be incurred due to participating in a study. So we think of this as parking, childcare, lost wages, travel expenses, things like that. One of the ways that we want to capture different stakeholders' thoughts on incentives and what they usually consider when they're deciding what an ethical incentive would look like is using conjoint analysis. It's usually used in marketing research to understand consumer preferences in different parts of a product or service that's being offered. But in our study, we want to see the relative value or weight of each study attribute on a person's decision to participate in clinical trial research. And what you'll see in this table right here is the table that we provide to our participants after they complete an interview or a focus group. And we ask them to consider these different attributes on the left-hand column here and varying different combinations of these levels and to let us know which attribute they most value by completing a survey involving different scenarios using these attributes. A big part of our study is our community advisory board. Our community advisory board is comprised of people living with HIV, HIV researchers, and IRB members and bioethicists. So we're able to meet with our community advisory board once a month and get key input on different types of aspects of our study that we might not otherwise consider if we didn't have the input from this community advisory board. They're also able to give us insight into different questions we might consider, and were really integral in what kind of questions we asked in our focus groups and our interviews, and helped us develop those study materials. Another key takeaway that we really want to consider, not only in how we incentivize research participants, but also in research in general, is that the community members or people that we are conducting research and wanting to have participate are experiential experts and are valued. While investigating how we can create more ethical and equitable incentives in biomedical HIV research, we also have some concurrent goals. One of that is that we are currently writing blog posts with members of our community advisory board who are living with HIV, because we want to capture their perspectives in how they're compensated in research or maybe in other community advisory boards that they participate in. And we can help give them that platform in these blog posts that we collaborate with them. We also want to demystify the research process among community members. Not only can this help increase trust in the research community, but it can also aid in better recruitment if people are aware that they can participate in clinical research, even if it's not, for instance, a last resort or something that they wouldn't have considered previously. It's something that they can consider at whatever stage of treatment they're in or in whatever prognosis they have. And we also are integrating stakeholder and community member input in every phase of our study by meeting with our community advisory board every month. So having that constant and consistent communication has really aided in not only our rapport with community members and other stakeholders involved in this study, but also in learning how to better demystify the research process and share the work that we're doing and disseminating the findings as we have them. So what have we learned so far? If you have read the protocol paper, you will know that our first phase of the study involved conducting a national survey. And in this survey, which we have conducted through Amazon MTurk, we recruited and surveyed 292 people living with HIV in the United States. And this is just a snippet of some of the information that we received through that survey. And that when we asked them about their attitudes toward payment, 96% of respondents believe people should be paid. 91% considered payment a benefit of participating in research. 80% agreed that payment influences whether they want to participate in research or not. 70% felt that there should be standards or policies on payment in research. And 64% expect another benefit if they're not receiving any payment. Important to note, we found that women were less likely to expect another benefit than men. We've also been conducting focus groups and interviews, and while we haven't completed all of them, this was a big point that we've found so far in our preliminary findings. One of the questions that we ask in our interviews and in our focus groups is, when is an incentive too much or too high, and too little or too low? And what we found so far, again, this is preliminary and no data analysis has been conducted thoroughly yet. We found that most interviewed researchers and IRB members were more concerned about incentives that are too high. And none of the interviewed people living with HIV voiced concern over incentives that are too high. They did, a couple people living with HIV expressed that they would be hesitant to participate in a study with an incentive that isn't proportionate to the effort required due to greater perceived study risk, but they'd never actually known of an HIV study that offered an incentive that was too much, that they would be more skeptical or less likely to participate in. I do want to add that when we are conducting these interviews, it is comprised of 12 people living with HIV, 12 IRB members or bioethicists, and 12 biomedical HIV researchers. So that said, this is a small sample size, and but this is what we found so far. So some future directions. For our study, we are currently trying to finish our focus groups and interviews, and then we will analyze that data, including data from the conjoint analysis survey, and ultimately create case vignettes in collaboration with our community advisory board. We will test these hypothetical study scenarios, aka the case vignettes, with members of each of the stakeholder groups. And then we will analyze the decision making of the participants and disseminate our findings with the community. Overall, though, we have some considerations. One is we do want to consider ethical research incentives in global research. For instance, I did have one interviewee who is a HIV biomedical researcher, and he conducts studies internationally. And he made a great point. He said, Kara, I conduct studies in Laos and we provide bars of soap for our participants. That's not something you would present to participants as an incentive in the United States. And I didn't really have a comment for that, but it's something that's important moving forward as we consider what might be ethical incentive-wise in a global scale or in international research that's not being conducted in the United States. We also want more meaningful integration of community member input in the research process. It's not just a box that you want to tick off that you have a community member who's voicing their opinions or input in your study. It's something that we really want to value and should value because community members are experiential experts. Incentive transparency in research publications. Right now, you may not read a lot of publications or articles that share what kind of incentive was offered in research. But being able to familiarize ourselves with what incentives are currently being offered will help us move forward and develop ultimately a systematic way to guide ethical decision making, be that a database, framework, a guideline, or something else that we haven't even considered yet. And that concludes my presentation on our protocol paper and what we are doing in CASH. Thank you for attending today's Journal Club. And I do want to give a special thank you to the principal investigator, Dr. Brandon Brown, and to our Access Lab Director and co-investigator of the study, Dr. Gallia.
Wow, great presentation, Kara. I mean, even though I know the study well, it's always really interesting to hear it encapsulated like that by somebody else. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to invite the listening public to to have a conversation. So questions we have, or maybe just a broader conversation about this work or related work. And I would like to start off with a question that, so you mentioned this interview where someone mentioned a bar of soap. It got me really thinking about how different settings will place different values on different things. And I think that, $1, $5 or $10 compensation for a study in the US is different than value-wise, like currency-wise, than what $5 or $10 may be in another country. Dr. Brown and I, as you know, have done international research together, and it's not uncommon for a standard payment amount in Peru, even for biomedical studies, to be on the order of $5 or $10. Even for somewhat invasive procedures, say a blood draw, which involves, puncturing the skin, or taking, as we did in one study, rectal swabs. So something that's embarrassing, uncomfortable, and sure, people may get some value from the health information they get from it, but it's the same thing they could get if they went and they paid for it. I guess my question for you is,
Right.
I mean, so you mentioned this, the soap issue. What other, implications do you think that brings up, or what other thoughts do you have about varying payment amount? I mean, I guess sorry, I'll just say one last thing, but I was just thinking it's not restricted to international work because $1 in Tampa, Florida, goes a little further than probably $1 in LA. You know,
Right.
even the gas prices are like over $5 or $6 in California, and they're still like $4 here. So I don't know what my question is, other than what thoughts do you have about that?
Well, you bring up a great point, and that's actually one of our questions in our interviews and focus groups is how people, what study specific factors might one consider when they're deciding when ethical incentive should be that where the study site's located or the characteristics of the population they're seeking to collect sample from, being that socioeconomic status or what their diagnosis is, if it's people living with HIV. Um, and what I've found so far, even though we haven't analyzed the qualitative data yet, is there are mixed views on whether an incentive, this is, US based, whether an incentive should be standardized and not dependent on study location, or if the very location where the study's being conducted should be considered. There's participants who believe no, it's more about the time and the effort, regardless of where you're living. And other people, like you mentioned, Tampa versus LA, cost of living is something that other people do feel should be included in what you consider. Um, and I think that's something that we should keep in mind moving forward is um, when we're analyzing the data is what speaks more to, I guess, majority outlook on what should we consider. And right now, I think it will probably be that cost of living is really important because $1 in one place can go much further than $1 in another place.
Seems like that may have made a good conjoint analysis variable. But at least the investigators will hopefully stratify their data and look at differences between sites. I see that participant Jeff Taylor says, given the huge income disparities in the US, puts this in the chat, determining appropriate incentives is a huge challenge. Great.
Oh, can I add a comment on that?
Of course.
So one of our interviewees actually mentioned historical oppression of minority groups and how paying a higher incentive specifically to people from a minority group that's historically been oppressed might actually increase trustworthiness in the scientific community, but also be sort of, in her words, reparations for historical oppression. So his comment reminded me of that interviewee.
Well, these are really pearls that we should hold on to. These two are both issues that we haven't really discussed in the study. Since I'm in the study team, I could say we haven't really discussed them, but definitely put a pin in those.
There's
I'm
been,
like,
yeah,
this is part of the story.
great qualitative data. I think we're going to get a lot out of it when we analyze it. Things that we haven't considered as a study team. That when I'm interviewing and speaking to participants, I just have that light bulb moment and that aha moment where it's like, wow, we haven't even thought about that. So I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes once we actually sit down with the data.
Research is cool. All right. So, questions from the audience. Dr. Brown, I'd expect no less. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so Kara, first I wanted to say wonderful presentation, beautiful slides.
Thank you.
Hopefully you will let us use those to actually explain the study to others, because I think you did a great job in doing that with your presentation. And also thanks for your leadership in the study. It's always surprising to hear the purpose of the study time and time again, which is how do we make decisions on what to pay people who participate in research? It seems like this is relevant to every human subjects research project that exists, but no one has really figured out the payment issue. So we're hopefully gonna be accomplishing something in the study that will impact the entire research enterprise. And this study is important for many reasons. And Kara, you're helping make it happen. And as the coordinator extraordinaire of CASH, I was curious to see and to hear what has been the most fulfilling part of your experience as the coordinator in the study, and maybe what have been some of the challenges that you faced in accomplishing the study aims? Because I know every research project has its challenges, and this research project has presented many challenges that we will overcome.
Thank you for that, Dr. Brown. So one of the greatest parts of being a coordinator for this study is getting to really immerse myself in the community member, just the community-based research, having it directed by them and getting input day in and day out and valuing that, and then incorporating it in our IRB amendments and all of that stuff. It's been great to see the collaboration between researchers and community partners. One of the barriers, or I guess I would say challenges, is probably because I'm newer to research, and one of our stakeholder groups is interviewing researchers and IRB members and bioethicists, people with extensive experience in research. Just having the interview and being able to collect the data and respond to any questions they have without myself feeling intimidated by the process, because I am newer to just the research realm in general. That's been something I've had to achieve and overcome as a personal barrier, is realizing that I'm the interviewer, so I'm asking the questions and collecting the data, and I realize you have questions, but we have questions too, and that's why we're conducting this study. So yeah.
Great. We have a few more comments in the chat. Jeff Taylor continues, we should always err on the side of more rather than less, even though we'd likely get pushback from the institutional review boards concerning about possible coercion. This data will provide some ammunition.
Love it. I agree.
And participant Vicky, or Dr. Lynn, says or asks, did anyone talk about fear of losing benefits due to increased income?
So we have had that brought up. Participant wise, I'm thinking of the interviews I've conducted with people living with HIV, and for the most part, they didn't voice that, but we also have some participants who their experience in clinical research has been more minimal. But we've talked about that, especially as a CAB, as a community advisory board agenda topic, and how institutional barriers such as needing tax forms filled out, and if they're having disability benefits, how research participation might impact that, and having a certain threshold that you have to follow. What is interesting is, even though I haven't heard much from people living with HIV, I have heard about there's a participant who was a research coordinator in the northeastern part of the United States, and she actually works with participants who, if they say they're going to have a problem participating because they currently receive disability benefits and they're worried about losing it, she will work with that person one-on-one and come up with an incentives plan so they don't lose their benefits but can still participate in the research. So that was interesting. And like I said, we haven't analyzed the data yet, but I'm excited to really kind of pilfer through and analyze more of that interview, because she provided a lot of golden nuggets in that interview that we don't hear a lot about. So I'm glad that we were able to get her input as a stakeholder.
Cool. Is that a hand, Eric? It is? Okay. I mean, I can see it's a hand. I didn't know if the hand was for her.
Comment regarding the inclusion criteria for your study. I was curious, was this study specifically focused on English speakers only, or primarily English speakers? I ask because in my work that I've been supporting for my major professor, I am the person in charge in terms of navigating those administrative tasks, particularly for Spanish-speaking only populations. And I've never in my life experienced the challenge of navigating that process that is, literally not built for them because everything's in English only. And I just wonder your thoughts about how, that aspect might either improve or broaden the perspective of this particular work.
So far we haven't captured that. But that is a great future consideration to be mindful of moving forward, including people other than English speakers.
Do we have any of those data in the national survey? Or as we like to call it, the MTurk survey?
I'm not sure.
To go back to that paper.
Oh, no, it was a requirement for them to speak and understand English to participate in that survey.
But I wondered if we asked if they spoke more than one language. Probably not, but it's a really good point.
It's one of the reasons that this journal club meeting is so great, is because we can receive feedback and kind of think of how we can implement it moving forward or in another study, because we're hoping that there's something that stems more from this study and we can branch out and think of things that we hadn't thought of before.
So we've now heard 3 limitations, I guess. I mean, this is a limitation, right, to the study. So it's a good point, Eric. Jeff also mentions great example of flexibility in providing incentives that don't jeopardize participants' benefits in reference to the your previous comment, Kara. Rita adds an interesting topic.
Thank you, Rita.
Other questions or discussion topics?
Kara, this is Kristen Kasilik. I'm sorry I didn't raise my hand. I can't figure out how to do that on my phone.
Hey, Kristen.
Hey. So really good presentation, Kara. Very nice job, I thought. And
thank you, Dr. Kasilik.
Oh yeah, this is a really interesting study. I think very important. In fact, I would even frame it as a social justice issue. And one of the things, I think you were getting at this when you said looking at location, stratifying your sample and looking at location, Jer, when you said that. I really see a lot of implications for guiding research with participants who are recruited through these online platforms, which we're increasingly using. And I'm wondering if maybe that was one of the motivations for the study. I wasn't sure if that had played into it because this was done partially on MTurk. But I just wanted to point out that I think that there is a lot of advocacy work that could be done in that area. Though I think, though there have been recent publications on ethical payment of participants through platforms like MTurk, I still see all the time projects where the participant incentives are incredibly low. And I feel like sometimes it's almost seen from the researcher's point of view as like an advantage of using a platform like that, is we can pay participants less, when in fact that's not the point of the platform itself, right? So recently we started using a platform called Prolific, and I found it really interesting that they have an incentive calculator on there that it might be worthwhile to take a look at, that makes a recommendation about an appropriate level of compensation given the length of your survey, what you're asking of your participants. And I'm not quite sure what goes into that logarithm. Like, I don't know what data they're using to make those calculations, but I think that the work you all have done here could be something that would be really useful to those platforms. So I just wanted to mention that, and just excellent job with your presentation.
Thank you so much. I saw Dr. Brown reaching for something to write with. I think we're both going to check it out as soon as this call ends, because that's something that I know I didn't know about, but I'm interested too, what kind of algorithm they might be using to determine based on your responses. Thank you for that.
Yeah, when Dr. Casilla talks about low, of course, I mean, the argument might be, but I think the argument may be weak at best, is that it's one thing if you're answering questionnaire, it's another thing if you're like doing something that could risk your life or being asked to stop taking HIV treatment. So
Higher risk, yeah.
those are comparable. Those aren't exactly comparable, but I think the broader point that Dr. Kostelik is making also, it's true on these like platforms like mTurk. I want to say that some of the incentives are like $1 or $2. I know at least in our studies
That's
we
right.
pay 4 times that, like on purpose, because we think people should at least get like minimum wage, you
Yeah.
know.
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
but on the other hand, uh, there is no study that I know of where someone would hand out a questionnaire and offer an incentive for $2 or $3 or 10 for that matter. It probably be closer to 15 or 20 in the US. So, and I don't even know where I get those numbers from, it because there is no database. Nobody knows how these decisions are made, and many times the incentive amounts are not published along with the results of the study. And as a reviewer that has asked for those data, it's been denied in the past. And Dr. Brown will recall a very specific incident where that was the case. So, anyhow.
Can I add to that actually? I think you raise a great point, Dr. Galia, on what you're saying. I just completed an interview earlier today, and the person was talking about how he provides at least some sort of incentive for his socio-behavioral research, which is mostly surveys. But he has peers who they don't offer anything. They see it as it's just a brief survey. I don't, doesn't take much time. And so that's another thing is we want to capture not only how we should approach it moving forward, but also the subjectiveness of incentives and what's determined an ethical incentive right now. To one person, it might be ethical. To another person, it might not be. So capturing everybody's perspective in this study is like really big and something that we have to do moving forward before we can even think of what an ethical incentive looks like. And that's something that I feel we're doing with our interviews and our focus groups, because we've gotten a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah. Great conversation. Other thoughts or experiences?
Jer, I
Yeah.
was thinking to build on something that Kara just mentioned about your experience with the interviews. So it came to my mind that what's fair for one person could not be fair to another in terms of the incentive type and amount. So in some conversations that I think all of us have had with community members and researchers alike, some people have told me that they can accept differential payment for participants in the same study with the same procedures as long as the difference is kind of piled higher for those who are lower income versus higher income. And this is because, let's say, if you're doing a study like enrolling surgeons and people who are housing insecure, $50 may not cover the cost of gas or bus or parking, time off from work, cost for caregiving or babysitting for one person, but the other person, might not need to worry about any of those things. So the incentive type and amount might really impact folks who have a lower income versus higher income. And this might also point to some of the underrepresentation of different groups in research. And I hopefully will kind of get at some of this in this study. And maybe we already have, Kara, because I think you know more than all of us about the participants so far.
I have heard from several. Really, if I think about it, pretty much the majority of participants have mentioned socioeconomic status. And while people living with HIV that I've interviewed are more concerned about providing an incentive that would allow the person to be able to miss work to participate. So something higher. A researcher or an IRB member, on the other hand, is thinking, well, if you provide a higher incentive to someone of lower status, socioeconomic status, that could cause coercion for them to not participate, for them to participate in something they wouldn't actually feel comfortable doing. So we've gotten mixed input so far on that. But I've also heard from several people about the idea of individualizing incentives. And while that might be more work for the researcher, that's something that I think is kind of exciting and not what we're currently doing. Something to consider.
Like precision type sort of incentives. I guess this is really a question around equality versus equity.
Yeah.
You know, that is an interesting concept. For so
That's so
long,
good.
it's been across the board, everybody gets the same. What I'm hearing is conversation around what if it was a differential system that took into account different relevant attributes of the person, including whether they want. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about are participants, including in this study, that don't want an incentive, but we can't do anything. We have to send them the incentive because that's the rule. So
I haven't heard as much about that, but yes,
I believe it's happened in the study. Jeff would know, but I think these are people who don't want or can't accept a check because they're
their job.
university employees or whatever, or they just don't want it or don't need it. Usually we say take this and maybe donate it or something like that. So. Well, this has been a great and robust conversation. Oh, wait, I do see a few extra comments and I don't want to miss them. Rita says, just a comment based on my experience, there's still the quote, healthy volunteer bias. Even by providing incentives, vulnerable samples are still left behind. Jeff says, conversely, if the idea is to compensate for lost wages, a highly paid professional would get far more than someone who's unemployed, unhoused, etc. So all of these things seem like they could be factored into an algorithm. I'm really curious, as you are, Brandon, to take a look at this algorithm that Kristen mentioned. We are just about out of time. So I want to thank everybody for making time today. And Kara, a really excellent, as usual, presentation, one that will be posted on the Access website. Yeah, let's give Kara a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
If you're watching this video as part of the Access Club Journal Club series or the Access Lab Journal Club series, stay tuned for future Journal Club presentations, or if you're at USF and are interested in joining the Access Lab, click on the Join the Team link and drop me a line and let's talk. Once again, thank you, Kara, and everybody for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you have a pleasant evening. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.